knee, and she says, do you want to see? I put my hand on her breast, and she says, do you want a kiss? Gently, 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 Johnny, gently, Johnny, my jingle.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the fourth Former People Film Podcast. This month's episode will focus on the 1973 film The Wicker Man, starring Christopher Lee and other familiar faces. This episode, however, will have a few different faces from normal. While you'll still hear from myself, Stephen Mihalkov, and my co-editor, C. Derek Varn, we're going to take this special opportunity to introduce a few of our other editors who have joined our project. Today you will also hear from Dinesh Raghavendra, Michael Johnson, and Ronak Soni, all contributing editors of various stripes and forms to Former People.
Derek, why don't you start the discussion on introducing The Wicker Man? I think in particular, of all of us, this may be perhaps one of your most favorite films, if I remember you correctly.
Yeah, the 73 Wicker Man is one of my favorite films, for a variety of reasons. I think when you first see it, and you think, oh, this has the production values of a Hammer film. And the director, Robin Hardy, is not one people generally know that well. It can be superficially misread as a movie. And so it has a lot of defenders that read it as an allegory about how awful Christianity is or how awful paganism is. And I think the movie is actually maybe much, much smarter than it's even aware of, if that makes any sense. It has some things to say about, neo-romanticism and pagan revivalism that are accurate. In fact, they're more accurate now that we know some more things about it than even in 73 when the movie was written. But, probably that's the script of Anthony Schaefer. And also, it's an Anthony Schaefer script, which is, gives it some good, solid writing into it, despite the fact that it kind of seems to have wanted to be filmed as sort of a British horror exploitation film. It's inspired by David Fincher's novel The Ritual, which I actually don't think is as smart as the movie. But anyway.
Yeah, so let's go through our crowd and have some quick thoughts, and then we can open it up for a full discussion. So, starting randomly, Michael, what were your thoughts in watching the film?
I guess in general, I'd say that first off, I did really like it. I'd never seen it before, so that was really interesting. And I just learned a fair amount about paganism, and I guess some hints of neo-paganism revival and things like that in a class that I was taking. So I guess it was nice to sort of see how all of it collected, but I definitely did see past the immediate layer of, I guess, the whole Christianity versus paganism thing. That's just the general overview that I got out of it, I would say. I get into some specifics later probably, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Sure. Ronak, what was your thoughts?
Well, interestingly, I never thought about it as a Christianity versus paganism thing. It's like more, as far as I can see, it's more about the origins of religion in some sense. Like precisely that speech Christopher Lee gives in the middle, where he talks about why his grandfather introduced it, and how it controls people. That's what seemed to me to be about.
Yeah, for sure. And Dinesh, your thoughts too.
Yeah, for me it was more like a religious parable. We sort of pigeonhole it into this horror category, but I feel that there is more going on underneath the surface. If you look at it, Wicker Man, it's like a post-60s film, and it has this very indigenous feel to it. So, for me, it was never actually a horror film. There's more going on underneath the surface. So it cleverly tricks us into, thinking it's a regular 70s horror movie when it's actually not. That's what I feel about it.
Yeah, in closing out, I hear a lot of my own thoughts in pretty much what everybody's said. So I think what really strikes me about the movie, and this may echo, as I said, what people have said, is that you may get this impression, this Christian versus paganism, but what you're really experiencing, at least from my perspective, is, yes, there's a certain artificiality about this notion of paganism, but what's even more interesting is that how the paganism in the film manifests itself reminds me in many ways about how I think society now sort of operates in its own ideologies and sense of what religiousness or spirituality or community is and is not. And so, you will see sort of weird artificialities like you see in Summer's Isle pop up all over the place. And to me, it felt very much like a contemporary film as much as it felt like a film about the 70s.
Yeah, well, I feel like this is a film that is weirdly relevant now because the 70s is actually weirdly relevant now. Probably as much as anything else. It's interesting because to me this is a parable about both the development of religion and romanticism, but also if you want to look at it as a religious allegory, you have foil characters that at first don't seem like foils because Edward Woodward's Inspector does not seem like a foil for Christopher Lee's Lord of Summerisle at all. But if you really think about the movie, they're both people who doggedly stick to religions that the rest of their worldview actually doesn't seem copacetic with.
In the last century, the islanders were starving. Like our neighbors today, they were scratching a bare subsistence from sheep and sea. Then in 1868, my grandfather bought this barren island, began to change things. A distinguished Victorian scientist, agronomist, freethinker. How formidably benevolent he seems. Essentially the face of a man incredulous of all human good.
You're very cynical, my lord.
What attracted my grandfather to the island, apart from the profuse source of wiry labor that it promised, was the unique combination of volcanic soil and the warm Gulf Stream that surrounded it. You see, his experiments had led him to believe that it was possible to induce here the successful growth of certain new strains of fruit that he had developed. So, with typical mid-Victorian zeal, he set to work. Best way of accomplishing this, so it seemed to him, was to rouse the people from their apathy by giving them back their joyous old gods. And that as a result of this worship, the barren island would burgeon and bring forth fruit in great abundance. What he did, of course, was to develop new cultivars of hardy fruit suited to local conditions. Well, of course, to begin with, they worked for him because he fed them and clothed them. But then later, when the trees started fruiting, it became a very different matter. And the ministers fled the island, never to return. What my grandfather had started out of expediency, my father continued out of love. He brought me out the same way, to reverence the music and the drama and the rituals of the old gods, to love nature and to fear it, and to rely on it and to appease it where necessary. He brought me out.
He brought you up to be a pagan.
A heathen, conceivably, but not, I hope, an unenlightened one.
So with Christopher Lee, you have the distinct feeling that like if you go through like his great grandfather invented the religion based off of, Victorian misreadings of Celtic paganism as a almost scientific experiment to regrow the land. It was just a way to like try to get people to use more different fertilization techniques, and he wrapped it around in all this spiritual baggage. But his son actually believes it, who is Christopher Lee's Lord of Summerisle's father. And you have the distinct feeling that Christopher Lee believes it sort of in the ideological sense of he's so attracted to his aesthetics, it doesn't matter to him if it's true or not. And conversely, Edward Woodard's, hardcore Christian character, for all his hardcore Christianness, he still pretty much is a believer in Enlightenment and rationalism. So he also, too, is sort of in conflict with himself and kind of a hypocrite.
Yeah, let's open that up for discussion, because I think that dynamic between those two characters in the story is really helping to sort of unveil a lot of the issues that are coming about there. So I actually think Derek really articulated a lot of what I think about the characters. So let's open that up to everyone else. How are you guys thinking about that when you were watching the film?
Yeah, this is Dinesh here. So for me, it was always almost like an allegory of the, war between this free love, 60s free love, primitivism, and this, Christian conservatism. And how, how he comes across as this, on the conservative side, and almost as if, these two guys aren't characters, rather than, they're sort of this dialectical forces at odds with each other. So that's the way I saw their characters, whenever they interacted on screen. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is, on the surface of things, and I think, because all of us probably come from, fairly, liberal backgrounds, is that superficially, the Summerisle crowd, and Lord Summerisle in particular, manifest a lot of the sort of openness and, quote-unquote free love values that we probably have been more familiar with by virtue of our parents, grandparents in some cases, and just the society we live in. Yet at the end of the day, these are a group of people whose interest is to burn someone alive, and then this Christian cop who represents a lot of things probably all of us would find uncomfortable in a variety of ways: the hypocrisy, the judgmentalness, the closed-mindedness, the complicated view with his own sexuality, is nonetheless a guy interested in either finding out what happened to a missing girl or, if not, saving her. So to me, that was a very interesting, troubling dynamic, which didn't fit any easy pattern that I'm used to in narrative.
Yeah, that's true. The whole time we were probably siding with the free love Summerisle people, but after Woodward finds out he's going to die, you realize he's giving the standard atheist arguments, and the other side are being, well, whatever they're being.
I just remember laughing a lot at Edward Woodward's character. Every time that he said something along the lines of, "Oh, why are you people doing this? This doesn't make any sense." I either chuckled or laughed out loud at him, because it just didn't quite fit. It just seemed like I guess it was more of a conceptual difference, not like some kind of actual difference in full-on rationality or something like that. It was just dumb. It was just dumb to see him sort of disagree with their practice without any sort of basis for disagreement at all. It was more like talking past one another rather than actually disagreeing about it.
Yeah, there's a good exchange, I think, when the officers accusing Lord Summerisle's odd beliefs in I think procreation without sexual congress, and how insane that is, and Christopher Lee had to remind the cop that the Christ was born through a virgin birth, and he's pissed off that he actually called him out on that on that hypocrisy.
Yeah, exactly. And then even in the moments whenever he was initially looking for the girl because she was lost or something, or at least when he was operating on the assumption that she was murdered or something, he kept going around asking people like, so she was here but she's not, and they were like, yes. And then he said, so she was murdered then, right? And he was like, and all the people of Summerisle kept saying, well, yeah, but I don't think we would call it murder. I mean, murder and sacrifice are two different things,
Yeah, it's funny about that. That reminds me a lot of this is like comes from Kolakowski's notion of the cornucopia theory. So, like, whenever you're dealing with something that is irrational or perhaps religious, the person defending it will never have a limit to the types of arguments they can use to defend it because they're not bound by rationality. So all that kind of stuff comes up. And in fact, like you bringing up like the detective obviously being fooled left, right, and center all the time is part and parcel to what's going on in the plot, right? So Derek, you want to go into that a little bit, and maybe that'll be the next topic of discussion.
I think though one misreading of the movie is to see the detective as stupid. Because I don't think he is, and although if there's, I think I agree with Dinesh. This movie isn't really scary. It's not a horror film in the same way, except for maybe in the last 15 minutes of the movie. You kind of see the Dunning-Kruger effect all over this movie. You guys know what I mean by that?
Why don't you go into that?
All right. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is this from the study. I believe it was done about a decade ago. And the study actually indicated that the smarter a group of people is, the more likely they may be to be wrong, because their rationalization mechanisms for what they do are far, far more developed and sophisticated. And you can actually see that with both the detective and the Lord of Summerisle, in there talking past each other, because they're just so good at rationalizing and equivocating what they're doing.
Yeah, so here's another thought. Like, as we're watching the film, did any of you guys believe anybody? That sounds like a simplistic statement to make, but I think it has partly to do with this whole notion of quote-unquote identifying with a character. Possibly that's one element to it. Did we identify with anyone in this movie? Or two, did we ever get a sense in these rationalizations that we should or should not be convinced by what they're saying? Where was our position as a watcher of this film relative to what information we were getting?
I had a hard time identifying with anybody. I didn't think that I was, on one hand, I didn't really, agree for the most part with what the people were saying at all, and so I had a hard time being convinced by either side, whether it was the people of Summerisle or the officer character. I can't remember his name for some reason.
It's Neil Howie.
It's Neil Howie.
Yeah,
Howie.
That's it.
We know he has a name. Woodward's the actor. Interestingly, there's a lot of people that from this movie, particularly Christopher Lee and Brett Eklund. I don't know what Edward Woodward's done other than this movie.
He was popular at the time, being on a TV show.
Oh, The Equalizer.
Yeah. I think he was a cop, but I could be wrong. But it was something very popular, and they borrowed him, so to speak, for the movie. And the other added detail of the background of this movie, putting it in context, is it was. I think it's produced by British Lion Films, who was famous for doing films like the Carry On movies, these really weird British comedies that I think only the British could laugh at. But and they wound up producing two odd movies at the same time. It was this film, and they also did Don't Look Now. So if you guys remember that's with it's set in Venice with Donald Sutherland, Julie Christie are in Venice. There's murders going on, yet they're dealing with the psychological trauma of a lost daughter, and there's an intertwining between those two. And what's interesting are both of these movies are occupying the space of a horror film, and yet both are very, very complicated versions of this kind of story. And it's not surprising that when British Lion Films, who during this time was being acquired by somebody, didn't know what to make of those films and sort of just abandoned them a little bit when it came to marketing them. So both of them were kind of misplaced at the time, and yet became very big afterwards. So that's just some background thought I wanted to throw in there.
Yeah, I had a question for Stephen. Stephen, you said that the actress Britt Eklund. I mean, she apparently the claims she made about the nudity and all, it was false. So I would love to hear you talk more about that.
the very famous scene in the movie. So in the process of the town confirming for themselves that the police officer will be their virgin fool sacrifice, they are testing him in some sense along the way. And the very famous test is a scene where Britt Eklund, in complete nudity, is singing and pounding at his door, hoping for him to open it.
Thigh slapping.
Yeah, and thigh slapping too. So the interesting thing is, if he actually falls for her temptations, they can't use him as a sacrifice, but they have to test his purity. Naturally, he succeeds in resisting her. Unlike me, as I joke, she probably wouldn't have even had to knock on the door for me to open it. But yeah, so the story behind that is that there was a body double used in some of the scenes where you saw her nude rear end, and I think there's been some rumors as to whether or not she did or didn't know about that. Was she uncomfortable? From what I heard in making of documentaries, and this is straight from Britt Eklund's mouth, is that they used a body double primarily because she was self-conscious of the look of her ass, and so she wanted someone else to take that role for her. I mean, you see full frontal nudity of her, so it's not as if she didn't know she was being filmed in the nude. It's pretty obvious on that. It's just that one scene, for whatever reason, she was self-conscious. But yeah, there's a lot of weird rumors that have built up around this film, primarily because of this odd position it occupies as not really fitting in horror, being somewhat of a cult film. I think the other rumor is that at the end of the movie, when the Wicker Man burns and there are animals in there, people thought that animals actually did die during that, and from what I can find out, I don't think that's true. I think some people thought that they possibly did, but I also hear sources that said no animals were harmed. So you have this weird mystical or mythical element of this film where you have all of these weird stories coming up. But I think the film sort of is constructed in a way to sort of lend credence to the possibility of these odd things happen.
Well, from what I've read, the bare butt shot was a double because she was pregnant at that time, but the topless shots were hers. So, the bare butt shots were one that were taken without her consent. So that was what caused all the controversy.
Interesting. So I have no. So at the end of the day, I have no idea what the truth is. Probably, like through much of the film, like the detective, you're going through this, and I don't know what end is up, but I just hope not to be burned to death at the end of the journey.
So, one of the things I've thought about this is why would this movie seem so salient in 1973 and also right now? I mean, it's interesting to talk about. There's the 2006 remake, which we can talk about later, which is a truly awful movie, like hilariously awful. But there's also Robin Hardy decided to pick this back up. So in 2001, he made a sequel-ish to the film. I mean, not 2001, in 2011, he made a sequel to the film called The Wicker Tree. And there's supposed to be a third movie, too, now.
Yeah, I think the reception to The Wicker Tree wasn't particularly strong. I think the only person to have reappeared ever so briefly was Christopher Lee. And I didn't get... Yeah, I got the sense that the potential for the trilogy being completed is sort of precarious at the moment. But yeah, it does raise the question of this continuity of why a film from the 70s still seems to resonate. On a surface of things, that's not entirely surprising because there are so many films from the 70s that resonate. So obviously The Godfather, Chinatown, Apocalypse Now, you can go through the list of these films which still are thought of very highly. And yet, I think what you're trying to get at is that somehow The Wicker Man is still reflective of a sort of mood or mentality of the society. And my response to that is to say, I think the 60s generation brought with itself, so many ideologies and conceptions about the world that we're just sort of living with it. And I think this film carries it.
I would like to hear Ronak and Dinesh talk about that a little bit, because I wonder if if that cultural relevance is different if you're not British or a Canadian or American. So,
I mean, it does have, it does have an influence up to some extent. But for me, basically, the whole movie. I mean, you can sort of, if you've read up on your history, you can sort of recognize it. I don't really think that coming from, this an Asian background or something would have some sort of, effect on it. I never felt it in that way. So,
well, I think I was more thinking about like the fact that I think this is a critique of two different ideologies that were very big amongst baby boomers, because baby boomers, that's the group that gives you both. It gives you both the '60s in the U.S., but they also give you the evangelical / Nixon backlash to the '60s. I mean, that's the same group of people, generationally speaking.
Yeah. I think the related question to that is like, did the generational politics in India sort of go through similar things, or is it like sort of different? That's something I'm unfortunately not very familiar with, so I don't know if the dynamic exists the same where you guys are at.
Well, I don't see any clear parallel. India seems to be going kind of orthogonal to the way all that stuff went. Yeah, personally, when watching the movie, I knew all this history and I could see that this is what was happening and all that. But for me, I never really, it's not visceral for me. I don't see it as an important part of the movie.
Right, so I guess in the absence of that particular political context, like because I think all of us had a strong interest or liking of the movie. For you guys, like, what was the big carrying details which really resonated with you then, if it wasn't for this particular social or political cut of it?
Well, just because it's not visceral for me doesn't mean it's not interesting. So for me, it was more about the clash of two ideologies, just not two very ideologies that are very important to me. It's still interesting. I still watch Japanese movies about anime and all that, which have ideologies completely alien to me. They're still interesting.
Yeah, sure. Dinesh, you didn't get a chance to add to that.
For me, again, so, but as far as the movie is concerned, there were certain visual, details that really struck out to me. The Maypole dance, for one, I mean, that was like really stunning and, completely captured the imagination. So, yeah, but as far as ideologically, as far as ideology is concerned, I never really could sort of, see any parallel, as Ronak mentioned. But then again, the movie had a lot of rich, visual elements. And one thing that JP mentioned yesterday that I was thinking about was how, all these movies are set on islands that are sort of, separated from society and things like that. And, that has a significance which I had overlooked the first time. It's sort of, away from society and all these people are living, So JP said that, is that a sort of, have they decided not to become part of the regular society, and is there a slight, undertext there? So, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, and it actually reminds me of a way of thinking about how we take an interest in this film and how it relates to these issues. Yes, it's very visually interesting, and what they're doing on the island is, very not just ritualistic, it is beautiful. So I think one way of thinking about it is that it's a richly aestheticized world, and one way of thinking about that is like a criticism of Borges that I've come back to a number of times, but which I see in myself, which is when Borges was writing or doing whatever he was doing, people criticized him for, quote, living in an aestheticized world, which was, he lived in the world of literature, of books, of art, and people accused him of sort of removing himself from the society of Argentina around him, which was plagued with huge social unrest and political conflict. He isolated himself from it in a way of sort of dealing with the world. In a way, the fact that these communities exist in isolation or on an island may be tied to that a little bit, right? So in the aestheticizing of the world and the construction of some sort of social harmony or social ideology, they are recasting the world in an image which they prefer to engage in rather than the world as such. But I think the joke is, and I think someone else had mentioned this in a previous conversation to me, is like, that's how just people operate in the world. That's how people can just function.
Yeah, I think if you want to look, this is a very North American-centric sort of view, but, like, if you look at things where these sorts of things actually have happened, I don't know about anyone sacrificing anyone else, but, I mean, there's the obvious parallel of Burning Man, which, has a Burning Man in it. It's deliberately sets itself out in the middle of the desert. And originally, in the 80s and 90s, there was hardly anyone out there in the desert. It's actually not true now. And that's part of the whole thing. And you look at that, so you see that very real historical parallel. And you also think about the tropes of horror movies. You think about all these, usually it's Satanism, not paganism. You think about all these, like, mysterious, society movies. It's either very, very backwoods. So, it's like set, if it's set in the United States, it's set in, like, Appalachia in the mountains. Or it's these islands.
The one interesting exception to that is Rosemary's Baby.
I wasn't expecting Rosemary's Baby.
This whole thing where connection between aesthetic. I was saying this connection between aesthetization and isolation may be something that is kind of unique to the US sort of area, because here you just walk into any harvest festival, it's just going to look like a much more chaotic version of this. In fact, even in the US, there's that show about New Orleans, not Treme. People do have very formalized rituals and dances and everything, and all this in very similar ways to this movie. It isn't. You walk into. We have a festival here called Bakri Eid where Muslims sacrifice a goat. It happens in the middle of the city. It looks similar to this, really.
No, yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. And you're right. The aestheticized world doesn't have to necessarily live in isolation. I mean, I think we all do it, but I think maybe one way of sort of squaring that round peg is to say, like, even if you're around people, the act of aestheticization is, in some sense, resculpting the world in a more ordered or beautiful way. So there is some sense of distancing oneself in order to make the engaging in the world more manageable, palatable, what have you. So I think you're absolutely right to bring that up, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, in reality, if you were going to see a Santeria ritual, which would have some things like is seen in this movie, you're going to most likely see that in Miami or something. It's not going to be out in the middle of the woods or on a small island. But I think, like, I don't think though that the origins of the religion, say, like when you hear the Lord of Summerisle's tale, that doesn't work unless you're isolated, because someone can call the original Lord of Summerisle out for what he was doing if he's in the larger society as a whole.
It probably doesn't work in that time scale. That's very true. But in some sense, religion is just a set of cultural tropes that formalize how this particular society likes to be. So it's some sense a parable of what religion actually looks like. What the religion actually looks like. You're right, Ki, literally you need the isolation, but the lesson of the movie doesn't need isolation as such. It just needs longer time scales.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a matter of condensing it down into 3 generations, as opposed to like what would happen in reality, where that would take centuries, basically.
Well, here's an interesting question, or at least I hope it's interesting, and I think it relates to how people read this film or don't. And the question, in short, is the culture on Summerisle a cult, Is it just a small society? Is it a religion? Is it all of the above? The reason I bring that up is because I think a lot of people would say, like, oh, you know, it fits well into this sort of subgenre of cult movies, or not cult movie in a couple sense. Cult movie in the sense of people, you know, what we think of as people coming to it and enjoying it as a group of people. But I think cult movie in the sense of, like, it's about potentially a cult of people with a, you know, sense of how they view themselves and what have you. What do you guys think of that? Is this a cult that we're dealing with, or is it something different? Go ahead.
I never really understood the difference.
Yeah, I don't see that as a cult because, you know, the closest I have seen on cinema, I mean, that kind of cult, being shown is that movie called Martha, Marcy, May, and Marlene. I mean, it's like there'll be this one leader who'll have this complete control over all the members, and more often, you know, the intentions will be very evil and things like that. So, you know, for me, I never got that vibe, you know, from this movie. It was more like an isolated society that, you know, decides to distance themselves from the rest of, you know, mankind and things like that. That was the kind of, that was what I took out of it.
I guess the best way I could probably think of it is maybe it's more of a, I guess, a normalized cult, but only normalized relative to the island, to Summer Isle itself. So
yeah, Mike. That's an interesting thought, Michael. Because the way you phrased it actually reminded me of something I was just thinking about, which was how Max Weber we think about leadership. So, like, you know, I think in some sense cults are, in some sense, manifest this idea of the charismatic leader. So, like, in an early sense of social organization, you know, all sense of revealed truth and law or righteousness comes from, you know, an unquestionable leader. So theoretically, the original Lord of Summer Isle may have been this, but I think best examples we would have of are like typical cult leaders, like, you know, Jim Jones or whoever was in charge of, Charles Manson possibly, whoever was in charge of was it Reiko or Ruby Widge, one of those areas where there was a cult. So that would be one example. But over time, you sort of have to normalize the leadership in order for a society or an organization to outlive that leader. In this case, it was generational in nature, like almost like a royal family. So Christopher Lee's character, the third Lord Summer Isle, although definitely charismatic, I don't think is ruling in the same way as that kind of charismatic leader. I think there's a sort of there are social ritualized norms which have been built up, which can govern the society with or without Lord Summer Isle. Don't get me wrong; I still think he's important, but there is, like you said, more normalization going on. So in that sense, I think that's probably one example of why I wouldn't say it's a cult. It's more of an ordered society in that regard. I don't know if that's what you were getting to, Michael, but. Maybe.
What does Weber say religion is? Weber says religion is just a normalized cult.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that is what religion is. It's just the normalization of charismatic practices. I mean, that's controversial in of itself, but that may be part of what's going on here. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Hardy's view is probably a little different. He seems to actually be obsessed with paganism, and the sequels that he's making or has made seem to indicate that. But I don't know that we have to take the fallacy of the author here. We don't have to take the director's standpoint as particularly authoritative. This is not an auteur film.
And what do you guys think about the remake? I mean, like the Nicolas Cage movie. I haven't seen that yet, so I was wondering what do you guys make out of that.
So I enjoy it for how terrible it is. So I'm sure everybody in this call or anybody listening has seen all of the YouTube videos compiled of the choice Nicolas Cage bits, right? But what's really funny about those bits, if you really look at them and you have seen both movies, they're actually taken from this movie. So one of my favorite moments of the Nicolas Cage remake is when he's dressed in a bear suit and he's running to protect the girl and he punches out a woman just randomly in a bear suit, and then goes to the child and says, "Don't be frightened." That happens in this film too. I mean, he's not dressed in a bear suit; he's dressed as Punch. He knocks a guy out and then goes to Ronan. "Don't be frightened." I'm sorry, I would be frightened if some guy ran up to me. But yeah, so there's that element. But I think it's obviously bad, and I'm trying to figure out why. I think one of the details which makes it bad is rather than being just a cult of men, women, children, just a whole society of people, it's reduced to a cult of women. And it's very uncomfortable in that regard.
It's just women, and it's I don't throw the term misogynistic around very much or lightly, but that movie's pretty misogynistic. The way it sees sexual politics is basically women are a neo-pagan cult that to kill your children and you. So
I have to watch this movie. Apparently, I haven't seen it.
It's bad.
So I know, Ronak, you haven't seen it. Dinesh, have you seen the remake?
No, haven't. I've avoided it like the plague.
Well, I can at least recommend you watch those YouTube clips, because they can be funny.
Definitely.
It's hilarious. I mean, it is a movie that is so bad you will probably enjoy it, but because you're just like, it has a watching a car wreck quality to it. I haven't seen The Wicker Tree, which is the recent sequel, which came out about 3 years ago. Although from what I've read about it, it pretty much has the same plot as The Wicker Man, except instead of one person getting killed at the end, it's two.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think Chinatown has this issue too, in which Chinatown, I don't know if you guys know, there's a sequel to it. We'll probably discuss that. But the idea, in Chinatown also is planned to be a trilogy, carrying J.J. Gittes through the development of L.A. from the 30s through the 50s or 60s. And what happens almost is that in this original film, you capture a kind of magic or the accident of the fortune of people who have been working on it. And in trying to sort of recapture that, it's just very difficult. So I would say like the Two Jakes, which is the sequel to Chinatown, I would say is a very good movie, or at least above average movie. But it has this impression of not being as good, just primarily because of how good Chinatown is.
It's also like it's not a Polanski movie.
It's also, Roman Polanski, for obvious reasons, was not directing it. As you would expect. Jack Nicholson directed it, actually. But yeah,
it's the last movie he directed too, isn't it?
Yeah, because he got frustrated with directing at that point. But yeah, it's like, so what do you guys make of that? Is this like a film which just cannot be captured twice, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Jack Nicholson version was actually quite different from the Polanski version, I felt. I mean, particularly the production design and sort of things. I mean, it was very different. I didn't expect it to be, that well made. I've seen the Two Jakes, and, my expectations were very low when I started. I thought it might not be that good, but it actually turned out to be pretty good. I mean, definitely, I was caught by surprise. So.
Yeah. So do you think that, the Wicker Man is is pretty much suffering that same kind of conundrum where even if you make a really good movie to follow it up, are we just not going to see something like Wicker Man again?
I doubt that, because it's sort of, it's very much in many ways it's a product of its time. I mean, that kind of horror film and those tropes and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't see that, given the way, you never know, but I wouldn't bet on that.
Yeah, I don't think you can make something that looks like a Hammer film now.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, and I actually think that the fact that you can mistake this movie for a different kind of movie is key to its success. And I don't think, the kind of movie that you can mistake it for isn't made anymore.
You can make it like Paranormal Activity.
Ah, yes.
You could just imagine The Wicker Man as found footage kind of film. It's there's it's for whatever reason the detective's carrying a camera, and Christopher Lee's all wobbly, but because he's wearing a yellow turtleneck, you see him fine. But
it would be like the Blair Witch Project.
Which I do like, by the way. So, but I don't. I think like that's another film which like you do it once, you do it, it's fine. Forget it. You're done.
Our Paranormal Activity, which is a fine movie as far as shaky cam scares go, but you know, like I don't know whether there needs to be 4 of them or 5 of them or 18 of them or whatever.
Yeah. But, I mean, have you guys observed that Hardy and Schaefer actually novelized The Wicker Man and they changed the ending in the novel? The novel expands upon the film's ending. You know, in the movie, Harvey is being burnt to death, but in the novel, it features an epilogue where Harvey's seaplane is spotted on May Day, suggesting that he may have survived somehow. So this is what, I mean, those guys came up in 1978, 5 years after the movie.
Oh, that is interesting. I did not know that. That would be a terrible ending to the movie.
That's not the first time that a book novelization, well, not necessarily novelization, but the book form adds something that the movie didn't take, and it really changes the meaning. So another example would be in Clockwork Orange, where we have one more chapter of Alex reforming himself of his own volition.
Yeah, although that's not Kubrick's fault. Kubrick was working off of the American transcript, which had the final chapter removed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't want to. Forgive me if I gave the impression that I'm blaming someone for that. I didn't want to do that. But that's just one phenomenon. The other phenomenon is the Picnic at Hanging Rock. I don't know if you guys have seen or heard of this film. So it's Peter Weir directed it. So Peter Weir famously directed The Truman Show and Master and Commander and a number of other films. But Picnic at Hanging Rock, set in Australia around the turn of the century, a bunch of white Australian schoolgirls go for a picnic at this odd rock formation, and they disappear, and no one knows whatever happened to them. There's an extended chapter which was not published in the book but until like many, many years later, and it reveals what happened to them, and it's let's just say it's somewhat supernatural and completely, although the possibility of that happening was suggested in the book or in the movie.
But I've heard that Picnic at Hanging Rock, was based on an actual incident where several schoolgirls disappeared on a day trip to some mountain in Australia. So,
Yeah, I've been trying to find out what the actual event was. I couldn't really track it down. I think a lot of people haven't been able to track it down. Maybe bits and pieces of it were. But yeah, it's true. It's true. They were somewhat based on reality. But then the book itself had this explanation, which just gave a different feel of everything if you would have incorporated it. And I think again, it goes back to this whole notion of like what the Wicker Man is, and this idea of it being this sort of mysterious film. It's prone to. Whenever you get into this realm, you're prone to, as I said, mythology and rumor and all these little things. So I think that just makes the movie more and more enjoyable. Like the weirder and weirder stories behind it, the more you want to watch the movie.
Oh, by the way, interesting fact I just found. Robin Hardy started the novelization before Schaefer finished the script.
Oh wow, I did not know that.
Yeah,
that is interesting.
Probably they had a fight over the ending, and that's why it's called Anthony Schaefer's Wicker Man.
Yeah, that is a good point to bring that up. In that the author of the film, just based on how they describe it, is Anthony Schaefer, not Hardy. Even though I think whenever people interview about the film, they tend to talk to Hardy. I think in part because Anthony Schaefer may be dead at this point.
Yeah, and Hardy's still. Like I said, Hardy's making stuff in this vein again. Yeah, very recently.
Yeah, the Schaefer brothers are very well known. As you alluded to, Derek, they were very heavy hitter playwrights of their time. Anthony Schaefer had achieved film notoriety maybe a year or two before this with the movie Sleuth, which is with Michael Caine, and it's again sort of like this puzzle box movie. And his brother Peter Schaefer is very famous for being the author of Amadeus. As well. So it's that I also think adds to the credibility of the movie, as you pointed out near the beginning, Derek.
Plus it's based off of an interesting novel, and not the Harvey's novelization. It's also based off of Ritual. I think actually the movie's better than Ritual, the book, which I have read parts of but couldn't finish. But that's why I found that the fact that there's an alternate novelization of the movie by Hardy to be sort of interesting, since it was already based off of a novel in the first place. But you know how meta these things can get, so
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of meta, let me. This may be a good time to have like a final go around question for everybody, which is, do you feel in your life now, and this gets to like why the movie is relevant, do you feel like either you in particular or the society we live in general is like Summer Isle, and how comfortable or uncomfortable are we with that? So
no. So, I don't feel like my life is like Summer Isle at all. So
No, yeah.
I agree with that. I mean, I don't think that we have that kind of dynamic today. So, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't agree with that.
I think I will say I know people who remind me of Christopher Lee, but not the Summer Islands, just Christopher Lee.
I walk into a big family gathering and it's basically Summer Isle. I mean, yeah, the dynamics are very similar. I mean, he captured a very general thing of a close-knit community, I guess. So, I mean, no, they aren't going to kill anyone, but, by a hair's breadth.
family will kill you with kindness.
Yeah.
Well, if I look at it that way, yeah, I guess like when I lived in the South, it was like that in the United States, but very isolated, very religious, kind of not killing and sacrificing outsiders to a pagan god, but didn't really trust them that much. You weren't from around here, so to speak.
Yeah, I have the pessimistic view of myself in which I know to the degree to which I aestheticize things in my own world. So I fear that I could imagine myself as a Lord Summer Isle type person. I don't think I would be one who would, as we said before, going like, okay, it's time to burn the next person. Let's bring them to the island and have a good time. As much as like, in aestheticizing, your existence, would you be inadvertently creating a situation where you've isolated yourself from the real potential effects of your way of life on others? So that's something I worry about. So I may be the most pessimistic person here, but in a positive sense, I've said this before, I own a yellow turtleneck and a tweed jacket. And I think dressing up like the Lord of Summer Isle on May Day.
You don't have the hair though.
I have very long hair at this point in time. So
you do?
Yeah.
But is it standing straight up? That's the question.
If I wake up in the right time of day and I comb it up, yes, I can get it. I can get it to do that.
Michael, what do you know? Any Summer Islands or lords thereof in your life?
I do know a few Summer Islands. They're sort of.
Side note: you and I are from the same small town. So.
Yes, that is true. I do know some small Summer Islands. I didn't know any when I lived in Macon, Georgia. For all listening. But where I live now, where I go to school, I do know a few people like that, and even one of my professors, I think, is somewhat of a Summer Island type of person.
Is he a Summer Island in the Lord of Summer Isle sense, or in the local who is going through the rituals in Summer Isle sense?
More local yokel, I'd say. No one, I don't think anyone really has that sort of, I guess, that charismatic leadership going on in that sense, regarding or being Summer Island, air quotes. But I do know some people who are sort of that way, and it's always a fun talk to have with them.
I just think it's interesting that when I think of these people, I can think of both Burning Man hippies and like the people I grew up with around Macon as symptomatic of the same problem. So like Rotnick said, you go look at your highly religious rural family and it kind of resembles it. But then if you look at your hipster friends, who might be neo-pagans, they also kind of resemble it. So it's interesting in that regard that you could see it in so many places.
So, I've been thinking about this. Don't hold me to potentially doing it, but a thought which may be interesting for our readers or listeners is that every so often I think about going to Burning Man as sort of like a Hunter Thompson or Gay Talese or Tom Wolfe kind of way, and just trying to observe the insanity which it is. So if I survive that, if I do it and I survive it, perhaps it would be something worthwhile for for our listening audience.
If you're not sacrificed for the Burning Man, you'll be okay.
Well, I'd be the Lord of Summer Isle, so if anything's going to happen, I'm putting someone else in the box.
Oh, you better get on that.
I'll go. I'm down. Let's do it.
Those whom we hold dear, of orchard tombs where death lies near, of barren earth and orphan sun, of crop yields promised still to come. Will they dance with us this night? The answer lies with summer